And now for tonight's presentation, it's my great pleasure to welcome Jason Fidorra as our presenter. Jason is WDFW's District Wildlife Biologist for Benton and Franklin Counties. His responsibilities range from butterflies to elk and everything in between, including birds. His work includes a lot of field work aimed at conserving Washington's embattled shrub-steppe or grassland habitats and the many species that depend upon it. And these dependent species include the subject of tonight's talk, the Ferruginous hawk, the U.S.'s largest Buteo. Jason's undergraduate degree from Allegheny College in Erie, Pennsylvania was in environmental science. He was not a birder at that time. However, through a variety of internships and jobs, Jason hopped around North America to a lot of different destinations, from Texas to California, Hawaii, Jamaica, and New Hampshire. And it was through these experiences that his interest in birds was sparked and grew. He later went to graduate school at the University of Florida, where he focused on wading birds, after which he worked for consulting firms and did some tour guiding in the US and in Central America. 8 years ago, Jason accepted a job with WDFW. In addition to his professional work, he pioneered the July Challenge in his area to motivate more birders to be out and about, looking for birds and submitting sightings in that time period. He recently returned from a 3-week birding tour to Madagascar, a destination many of us would love to know much more about. And as Jason comes to the podium, just encourage you to make sure your screen is turned off and you're muted so that the recording that's going to be made and that will be available later at the WOS YouTube channel will be as high quality as we can make it. Thank you very much. And Jason, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Vicki and Dave. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here tonight. Let's see if I can do this right. I'm going to start sharing. There we go. Yes. I think you guys see the big one. So
we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. It's been a few years. I gave a talk on burrowing owls, another project that I've been involved with at WDFW. And if you missed that talk, I will be giving that or an updated version at the Othello Crane Festival next month. But today we're going to talk about Ferruginous hawks in Washington and cover some of their ecology and some of the research that's been done in recent years specific to Washington's population, some of the threats and problems that it's facing, and its current status, which has recently changed in Washington, and we'll talk a little more about that. Now I get to partake in a lot of surveys and fun field work looking for these hawks every couple of years when we do a big survey effort. We've had calls for volunteers and other folks. Some of you may have participated in Ferruginous hawk surveys in 2021 or 2016 were the last two big efforts. And you'll get to see what some of the outcomes of that labor has been. But in terms of a lot of the science I'm going to present today, a lot of that, I have to acknowledge Jim Watson, who's our Science Division raptor biologist for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So I'll be stealing some of his data and presenting some results that are actually just about to be published. So just a little bit, I like this quote because when you hear a lot that Ferruginous hawks are the largest Buteo, but you never really, at a distance when soaring, or it's kind of hard to tell size, as we all know, but they really are a splendid hawk, the largest, most powerful, and grandest of our Buteos, truly a regal bird. One who knows it in life cannot help being impressed. And they certainly are impressive, getting to work up with them a little closer, doing some nest monitoring. Ferruginous, for folks who don't know, is basically derives from the Latin ferrum, which is iron, or ferrugo for rust. And in English, ferruginous basically means containing iron oxide or rust colored. And as you can see in this picture, that rusty red color is where the bird gets its name. Its scientific name is Buteo regalis, which means royal or regal. So a good named bird all around. Identification of the species, if you haven't gotten to see one, or you're, they don't really stand out as that much larger typically to me. Size is hard to judge. I tend to look for that gape, the bright yellow or orange back of the bill that goes all the way down and under the eye. Now, they tend to often have rust-colored back and wing feathers, rust-colored thighs and legs, and the legs are feathered all the way down to the toes, which frankly I've never used for identification in the field, but you can see that well here in this picture. The tail's typically white in an adult. And notice kind of the head color on this one, really a kind of clean gray, not a lot of brown tones, which you see more in red-tailed hawks, which to me kind of look like a brown helmeted bird when you're driving by and see one perched on a post. This red-tailed hawk has a lot of rusty colors, and the thighs are feathered, but apparently doesn't go all the way down to the toes. There's a less prominent gape, but everything I said about the color on Ferruginous hawks is really complicated by the fact that we do have several different color morphs and varieties of this species, ranging from real light adults all the way down to the beautiful and less common totally dark morph. I'd say most of the ones that I see are sort of in the middle or towards the lighter side, but I'm sure there's some dark morphs out there somewhere. And this is just an image of a juvenile. They can lose this rusty chest color as they fled from the nest, but for a period of time, they kind of look like a lot of other nestlings, but you can still see that gape going all the way back under the eye. So the range of this species, just generally, this is the North American range. It's a North American endemic. Raptor breeds in the Columbia Basin down into the Southwest, in the Canadian provinces and the Great Plains. Spends most of its winter California, the Southwest, and northern Mexico. A little more detail within Washington. This is a mapped range based on sort of the habitat and requirements of the species. Again, it's sort of a South Central specialty. For the department, I cover Benton and Franklin Counties. So my district has typically been the historic stronghold for Ferruginous hawks in Washington. They do range up to Douglas County. Walla Walla has a few breeding individuals. Yakima hasn't probably had a bird in the last few surveys. And we've kind of seen a range contraction. I don't think the Douglas County birds are up there anymore. And so it's really kind of condensing down towards the confluence of the Snake and Franklin County and Benton County, Walla Walla. Well, you can see this is a eBird data for all of Washington. We do have, sightings. It's not completely news breaking if you find a Ferruginous hawk in January or December, but for the most part, you're most likely to encounter a Ferruginous during the breeding season from March through July. And they are one of the earlier breeders. Most of them return early in March or late February, and they start breeding displays and setting up territories by mid-March. And this gives them an edge on some of the other raptors like Swainson's hawks that don't arrive until later. And so they, even though Ferruginous are much larger, Swainson's can be a little more aggressive. And so there is nest competition out in the shrub steppe area where both of these species range, as well as the kind of ever-present red tail. And you may I often think of Ferruginous hawks as really lightheaded a lot of times when you see them in the field. I also think of rough-legged hawks the same way. So once you get to March, you really need to be a little careful. Rough legs obviously have a much smaller head, bill, and don't really have that mighty regal appearance if you get a good look at the proportions. In terms of nesting, these birds basically use what's available out there naturally, which would be in the shrub-steppe habitat. And so they'll nest typically on cliffs or rock outcroppings, but they'll also take advantage of isolated trees where they can build nests. Typically, we'll see that in old abandoned homesteads where maybe there's some black locusts still around, maybe a large cottonwood somewhere in this riparian area that gets a little more moisture. But they'll also nest just on the ground, and I've found nests on hillsides and slopes, scree slopes and basalt crumbled steep slopes are also pretty popular nesting sites for them. The stick nests that they build are really large, using large branches, typically a sagebrush. And one of the easier ways to tell it's a Ferruginous hawk nest is that you're really looking at sagebrush branches that are about as wide as your wrist. And if you compare that to red tails that are using much skinnier finger width branches, these hefty sagebrush branch Ferruginous hawk nests are pretty impressive. And they'll line it with some finer material and cow dung, which is pretty commonly found in there. But typically not a lot of fresh green material added. And so you might see that in some other raptor species as well. This is just an image of, as I said, they'll take advantage of isolated trees or dead trees in the landscape as well. That's an adult with some chicks. Again, you can really see the prominent yellow line coming up under the eye from the bill. And each year they'll add more material. Pairs will use the same, they have pretty high nest site fidelity. And so it's not uncommon to find the same pair in a territory, especially like most birds, if they're successful, they come back and do it again. But they'll also overtake other territories. This is a nest in Benton County that's had documented use since the 1950s. And so it's been on and off, but 70 years of birds adding nest material. You've got this structure that's really quite large on this rocky hillside, and that's a bird sitting in the cup at the very top of this stick tower that they've built over the decades. That's a female sitting on the nest the last year that I knew it to be active a couple years ago. And these nests stay on the landscape for a really long time, long after the territory's been abandoned. 10, 15, 20 years, you can still find remnants of these hawk nests where, unfortunately, a lot of the territories are no longer occupied. And this just is a picture taken on a survey of an abandoned site. I don't know how long, but probably over 10 years since Ferruginous have nested here, but a lot of the stick structure remains until a fire comes through and burns it up, or you'll get another species maybe nesting in it, adding material, but that heavy sagebrush base remains. In terms of the prey, they're typically considered mammal specialists, depend on kind of fairly large small mammals. Prairie dogs are considered their primary prey source on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. In the west of the Rockies, jackrabbits and other rabbits would have comprised the primary source of their prey. In Washington, we typically have found ground squirrels and more increasingly pocket gophers have been some of the primary prey items. And I'll get to this a little bit more as we move on. But so Washington has a few different things going on with the prey species. And so one of the studies that was conducted by the department over the years has been doing some satellite tracking to study migration, winter range, and post-breeding dispersal and movements. There's a 2003 publication by Jim Watson that has some of these data. There's a new publication that's been updated that's coming out in the Northwest Naturalist this spring. So that should be coming out, and it talks a little bit more about winter ranges and habitat use of these ferruginous hawks. But I'll share some information about some of the movements that we have for the species. This is some of that data from the satellite tagged individuals. It kind of looks like a mess. Males are in blue, females are in red. They're all kind of more or less doing a similar thing. Some of the females seem to be ranging a little further east, but a lot of the males as well. And remember that, you know, the Rocky Mountains are kind of cutting right through the middle of this. So these are individuals that all were breeding in Washington, and they are in an annual cycle, typically crossing the continental divide and moving over to the eastern population group. There's sometimes considered two populations. They're the same, there's no subspecies, but discrete breeding population east of the Rockies and west of the Rockies. And there's likely a good amount of mixing that happens. And this is a huge area for bird to cover in the year. Juveniles that were tagged were covering distances of 6,000 kilometers. And that large distance kind of over time, when they were able to follow the hawks from their juvenile year to adulthood and subsequent years, there's evidence of route learning. So they tighten up that wandering path as they get a little more experience. But typically the first year they were seeing distance over 6,000 kilometers, which is massive. And just to kind of show you a little more details about one of these, one of these hawks here to clear up the clutter. Here's just an example of, this is one female's migration out of Washington. And I mean, this bird is covering 10 or 11 states, I believe, throughout its annual, on this annual cycle. So this is a bird that's experiencing a lot of different weather, landscapes, threats, but at the same time is really opportunistic and able to follow resources to help get it through its year. It has no problem moving to find resources. And so I like to think of this and I guess it's pretty obvious. This is not just a north-south migration. This is a really excellent example of about as close as a circle as you can get when you think about bird migrations. I mean, this is really heading straight to the east, then down, and back over to California. So what's the reason for this? And like I kind of alluded to, it's all about food. So in central Washington, where these birds are breeding, all the birds from that study were tagged at the breeding grounds. They're foraging on our native Washington ground squirrels and some other things. But, you know, looking at our ground squirrels, we've got Washington ground squirrels, we've got Townsend's ground squirrels. We're starting to see some California ground squirrels too in this area, but these animals are only, they have a really fascinating natural history, and that they're only active a few months of the year. So they come out once the snow's melted and they stay on the landscape, fattening up as quick as they can. But by the end of May, early June, they tend to estivate down underground and don't come up again until next February or March. And that's right when those Ferruginous hawks come back to Washington. And July is when they typically leave Washington. So they have the adult hawks, well, have a fall migration that actually on average is more northeasternly, and they go up to the Canadian provinces and Montana and some of the states east of the Rockies, where they're foraging on Richardson's ground squirrels and prairie dogs. These are species that, this is a colder climate, spring comes later. So these animals are out later into the summer. They have a more mild summer until things get hot. So there's a lot more prey in July, August, September for these birds. Then they book it to California. Most of our Ferruginous hawks spend the winter in California, where there's California ground squirrels. And so then they'll hang out with California ground squirrels until it's time to come back up to the breeding season. And California, obviously a lot more mild. Those squirrels and prey are active a much larger period of time through the winter, and they repeat that cycle. So really fascinating migration that totally is different than what you think of with your typical neotropical migrant that have equally impressive migrations down to Brazil or whatnot, like a Swainson's hawk. But crossing the continental divide several times, something that we often think of as a big migration barrier, these birds are doing it twice a year. In Washington, we've been monitoring our population more and more closely over the past recent decades. We had a few major survey efforts in the 90s, and sporadically until now, we're kind of at an every 5-year survey where we're kind of going out. We're visiting all of the known historic sites, including any sites that we're anticipating are not historic and are still in use. But just going to all sites, doing a repeat observation, and there's over 260, maybe 280 historic known breeding sites in Washington. And we have staff and volunteer cover these throughout the breeding season to identify occupied sites, breeding success, and unoccupied sites. And the story has basically been that over time, fewer sites have been occupied, and fewer sites have led to successful production of young. For the definition of success is successfully fledging at least one offspring. So, okay, one nestling out of the nest, and you're a successful adult. What happens then? Well, we often don't have an opportunity to follow up on that. So success is considered one fledgling at least. Looking at some of this data kind of just a different way, the absolute number of pairs that we're talking about in Washington, we're not talking about thousands, we're talking about dozens. Even back in the 90s, this is after the species already been listed as a state threatened species, we were seeing numbers of pairs, 50 to 60 or so until the 2000s. Back and then around 2010, the last 3 surveys, which have been a lot more comprehensive, we're looking at 30 some pairs, high 20s, low 30s, and subsequently fewer successful pairs. We're talking about 22 successfully breeding Ferruginous hawk pairs in Washington in 2021. And that's a minimum count, but we think it's a pretty good number. There's probably some that we miss or that we can't get access to, but that's, I wouldn't add too many more to that. 95 was an anomaly. I need to look into that data a little more. I don't know if that was a severe drought or a severe storm event that can take place in the winter. If it takes place in the right time of the breeding season, can knock out a lot of nestlings or nests and result in really low success. But besides that 1995, the 90s were fairly good compared to what we're seeing now. These are all just kind of this is some data from our periodic status review. This is a document that the state Fish and Wildlife puts out for any of the species that are threatened and endangered. I think our goal is every 5 years, but I'm sure it is less than that in reality often. And they're all variations of the theme of basically, no matter how you measure it, Ferruginous Hawk in Washington is showing declines, whether it's number of fledged young, occupied territory, successful breeding pairs, and in my home district here, the Benton County, it's particularly bleak. Oh, that was kind of a busy slide. Apologies if you really wanted to look at the numbers and they just all go down. Range wide, the species, NatureServe is sort of a catalog species risks and threats and populations across North America. If you look at all the occupied states on the map, you'd see blue on the map would be good. Yellow is vulnerable. Orange is imperiled, and red is critically imperiled. The pink data, like BC, they just don't have enough information. They don't have enough birds there. But basically, there's no blue, which is secure. So almost across the range, the species is either listed as a species of concern or warrants some sort of protections. In Washington, it was listed as threatened in 1983. And those surveys, the last survey in 2021 and 2016, led a state to the petition, our Wildlife Commission, to uplist the species from threatened to endangered. So the Ferruginous hawk is now endangered in the state of Washington. It's special status in, I think it's more than 10 states now, but as I mentioned, basically all the states that it inhabits, and Canada and Mexico as well. There were some early petitions for ESA listing, the latest being 1991, but it was not warranted. And so it does not have federal status as a threatened or endangered species. That is protected still by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, like all of our, most of our native species in Washington. NatureServe ranks it apparently secure, which is a G4 level, but I don't know. I'm not sure how they're coming to that conclusion from some of the data that they're presenting on statewide range. Wait, so I don't take, I'd probably say it's probably more widely accepted as vulnerable. There have been modest increases in certain areas where prey is abundant and habitat's protected. Maybe this is just the species kind of cramming into what's left. I don't know. In terms of direct threats to the hawk, we basically find two causes of two basic causes. There's a variety of anthropogenic reasons that dominate adult mortality, and I'll talk about them a little bit more. But for juveniles, starvation typically is the main cause of death. And it's also the main cause probably for nest failure in Washington. Some of these threats, in Washington, especially, we're well aware of, residential development and expansion, agricultural expansion. But this is happening all over the Western states. Think of Colorado and some places in Montana. And these are in California, which is our wintering range. We're seeing a lot of major changes over the past several decades. And these birds, we have to think outside Washington because they need all these habitats to survive. Annual cycle. Electrocution, power lines and transmission towers, collisions with power lines, wind conflicts, poaching, and direct mortality on purpose. This isn't limited to somewhere like Mexico or Texas. We have our rehab centers here are regularly picking up in Eastern Washington, the animals, raptors that have been shot. They have so many that they've actually gotten an X-ray machine donated to them from one of the local physicians. And they X-ray most of the species that raptor that come in because they tend to find injuries that they wouldn't have only otherwise known. And a lot of them have to do with being shot with lead fragments and bullets still in the animal. Eradication of prey bases. Of course, this falls more into the starvation, but not only starvation in terms of adults. If your prey is further away or maybe no longer present where it was the year prior, it requires you to do exploring, farther movements, and all of these subjected to all these other risks. So they're kind of intricately linked. But prey base, I think, is really what's driving the issues in Washington. If you look at the species of the appropriate sized mammals in Eastern Washington, we're talking about things like Washington ground squirrel. This has been a species that's been protected for several decades in the state. It's a Washington species of concern. It's actually one of the few, it's not listed as threatened or endangered, but it is illegal to purposefully shoot or persecute them. And they're protected in Franklin County, well, throughout the range in Washington, but that includes basically the counties east of the Columbia River. In Benton County, Yakima County, Kittitas, and places west of the Columbia, you have Townsend's ground squirrel, which is a Washington endemic species. And they've been rapidly declining, a visible loss in the past 5 years. We're not sure if it's been disease or some really harsh winter conditions that hit at a very bad time. But I think it was the winter of 2018-19, we've seen a huge dramatic loss in colonies of Townsend's ground squirrels. Pygmy rabbits, you know, things breeding like bunnies. Pygmy rabbits apparently aren't behaving appropriately because they're endangered, federally endangered species in Washington. They get a lot of attention and active conservation actions as deserved, but their range in Washington no longer really overlaps where we have extant ferruginous populations, though the pygmy rabbit would have been more widespread down into Benton County and along the eastern side of the Columbia River. And jackrabbits. I believe our neighboring states still have open seasons with no limits on black-tailed and white-tailed jackrabbits. California, last I checked, at least those states all did, Oregon, Idaho. But we haven't had legal hunting of jackrabbits in Washington since I believe the 1971, when our populations started to, or finally were really tanked. And they're increasingly hard to find anywhere in Eastern Washington. So this is the prey base of a species, and almost everything is a species of concern. So it's not looking that good. You can think of the home range for some species as an indicator of habitat quality. In general, larger home ranges tend to be in less suitable habitat. That's because the resources are further dispersed. Animals have to travel further distances. And in general, or at least in theory, we like to think that nature tries to be really efficient and, you know, animals are lazy, I guess, and you don't want to travel farther than you have to, and you don't want to defend a larger territory than you need to. So typically you see larger home ranges in less suitable habitat. From the telemetry studies done in Washington, comparing that to more recent work done in the Canadian provinces, with some citations listed there, looking at several different hawks over several different years, which is why you have a sample size of hawks, territories greater than the hawks. They were able to follow the same hawk for several breeding years to come up with some home range statistics. And basically, if you look at the core area, which is basically encapsulates more or less 50% of the activity of the bird over the study period of the breeding season for one breeding year. Washington's average size was about 100 kilometers square. That compares to Alberta. This is the in the eastern prairies there. 3.5 kilometers square was their mean home range, core area, and the total home range 636 kilometers square in Washington compared to 36 kilometers in Alberta. So our birds in Washington, and square kilometers is really hard for me to picture. But if the home range was a perfect circle, it'd have a radius of 14 kilometers in Washington versus about 6.8 in Alberta. And so our hawks are traveling much further distances, especially now. Remember, this isn't going to be a perfect circle. These are going to be oblique, long, following terrain or habitat features. So their distances are traveled are going to be typically longer than that radius. But I just put that in there to help visualize it. And several studies have indicated there's really been a dietary shift since the 1920s, which is the first evidence we have for description of the prey in Washington, the Ferruginous hawk, for the hawks nesting in Washington. Initial reports indicated there was a jackrabbit at every nest, remains of jackrabbits at every nest, and the predominant food, were jackrabbits and ground squirrels. In the late 90s, a diet pellet study analysis was done, and of the items in and around the pellets at the active nests in Washington, there was a huge increase or a huge amount of insects, typically crickets. What we have called the Mormon cricket are fairly abundant in some of the shrub-steppe area here. But even though these are large for a cricket, they'd be small if they were ground squirrels. So it's quite a large number of foraging attempts to equal one ground squirrel. Someone did some math and found 60 crickets would be about one ground squirrel. Now that isn't 51% of the biomass that the hawks are eating, but it was 51% of the items being found. So that is a caveat. But running out to the grocery store to pick up 1 or 2 crickets at a time versus a ground squirrel when you've got 2 to 5 almost full-fledged offspring is a lot of effort. Which again, starvation is the main cause of juvenile mortality, and with increased provisioning effort, you typically see lower nest success. Land conversion, this is just a random Google image of basically no longer any shrub-steppe habitat in areas where there used to be historic nesting. Land conversion, even if there are patches of shrub-steppe remaining, you have increased disturbance. Fragmentation increases nest predators like coyotes and ravens, which are both predators of eggs and competitors for nest sites, and extremely aggressive and defensive. You have increased invasive species in grasses, and that increases fire, which is one of the driving factors that's eliminating prey and prey habitat. Basically, this is an old map that shows, our natural historic shrub-steppe in brown in eastern Washington. Green is forest land, and tan is the now cropland or developed areas. And we've had over 80% loss of the native shrub-steppe habitat. And what's really, that isn't the whole story, because our remaining 20% is just a shadow of the forest of sage that would have been occupying certain deep soil habitats of eastern Washington. And the deep soil habitats that are depended on by species like ground squirrels and a lot of burrowing mammals have been disproportionately lost, almost entirely. So, we think of shrub-steppe being this rocky, uh, you know, sagebrush covered area with all this basalt rock and coulees, and that's just what's been left of the Eastern Washington shrub-steppe because it wasn't good enough to farm. So, most of the stuff that's been converted to farmland, you could probably grow some pretty monster sagebrush out there and some Ferruginous hawk habitat. So what's the future look like for the species? Since having it listed in 2021, that helps increase its status and attention in the state. That helps us redirect funding. It helps partners kind of prioritize the species in some of their land management activities. One of our early steps is going to be to update our recovery plan and goals for the species. Our current recovery plan is 94 or something like that. So it's time for an update and revision. As an agency, we have a lot of hard decisions on how to protect our shrub-steppe species, even across the Columbia Basin. Our umbrella species, or these species that kind of get the most attention, I think would mainly be sage-grouse and pygmy rabbits in Washington, but that completely eliminates the range of the Ferruginous hawk. Most of that work is stuff happening in Douglas County, and not really taking into account South Central Washington species and needs. So it's important to protect those species and their habitats, but not everything's getting caught by those umbrellas. So, we have to have some, ourselves and our partners, need to start expanding these umbrellas and opening them a little further. We do have some actions that have been made. The state acres for wildlife, I'll talk about that in a slide. We've had some minor success for nest platforms, where hawks have used nest platforms, but this isn't really addressing the primary problem, which is habitat and prey. I think if you have ideal habitat and a good prey population, adding nest platforms there, if that's what's missing, is ideal. But putting up nest platforms where you're still losing habitat and prey isn't going to really do much. Nest sites, I don't think, are typically limited for the species overall. And we're really stuck with, we're reaching that point of how do you restore what's already been lost. It's not necessarily just conserving what's there, but there might be need to actually restore what's already been lost. And generally, it's going to take a lot of involvement with public and partners in the agency, looking at development projects and local decision making, submitting comments to plans, and making decisions that prioritize shrub-steppe and those species of concern. This is an image of a platform that was fairly successful. This is out on the Hanford site, some mitigation for impacts, I think, to building these high tension power lines was that they would add some habitat in terms of nest perches on them. And they are, that Hanford site is probably limited in terms of the number of natural sites for the species, and they've taken up using these. But they've also been indicated to have fairly long foraging distances because a lot of the prey base in that area is not doing well either. The State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement is a federally funded program. It's similar to the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, and it's federally funded, but the state Fish and Wildlife gets to direct kind of the program and how some features in it are laid out. Landowners are paid per acre to basically replace crops with habitat, or maybe not to replace crops, but to, instead of farming a site that was probably already kind of marginal for farming, they can instead get paid to put it into habitat. It's a little more restrictive, higher demands than the traditional CRP, so it's sort of seen as an option if they can't qualify for CRP. which is just generally the program that pays landowners to set aside marginal land and plant some a mix of species to just stabilize the soil to avoid soil loss. But it also provides a lot of habitat as well. Eligible locations had to be near recent nest sites, and these are typically these are Adams, Benton, Franklin, Walla Walla counties were eligible, and these are contracts with landowners that are 10 to 15 years. And this is just a map. The orange shows eligible areas for the Ferruginous Hawk safe. We have other safe programs across Washington, in Eastern Washington, that protects things like sage grouse in Douglas County or Palouse Prairie out in Whitman County. But it's a pretty interesting program. But again, we're talking 10 to 15 year agreements. These are, also depend upon a stand of habitat getting established successfully. And 10 to 15 years is pretty slow in terms of habitat recovery for the arid Columbia Basin. So I think with that, I'll just stop sharing maybe. My phone or I got my email here if you have questions that I don't get to, and we will I'll try to cover some questions now. Let's see, does this work?
You did it.
All right.
Oh, Jason, thank you for such a clear exposition of a tough situation these birds are facing. It's one of,
Yeah, I really wish I had, I got a cute picture of some nestlings that I should have kept up longer, just to end on a happier note. I didn't mean to turn it all doom and gloom there at the end, but there are some things we're working on with that safe CRP stuff, but rightfully uplisted to endangered in 2021.
well, we're used to thinking about climate change as one of the big bugaboos facing so many of our species, but it sounds like, well, I don't know, is there a component of climate change that is also affecting? You mentioned something about some of the wetter areas were doing better than drier areas. Maybe there's not a link.
Well, so wetter areas, I may have said, I think it had to do with the ground squirrels, right? So if when these are hawks that we want to have nesting in Washington, and they around the entire western states, there's other areas that have different timing when those ground squirrels and things are active, and so that's what they were exploiting. In terms of climate change, I think the biggest driver, and it's still the elephant in shrub-steppe restoration and protection, is fire. And hotter, drier summers, more drought. I mean, drought, no one's really in, droughts make restoration really challenging. It's hard to get shrub plantings to take hold or seed projects to grow if it's planted in a poor year, and you don't know until you plant and then find out what's happened. So we've had challenges with restoration, and then just fire loss from a drying climate, and invasive cheatgrass is really the story for the Columbia Basin.
Well, Elaine typically monitors questions that come in from the audience. Elaine,
Hello there, Vicki. I am ready to read. I have a nice question. Kim is wondering if there has been any impact from avian flu for this species. It's got so many things going against it. Any information on avian flu affecting ferruginous hawks?
So I don't know. Offhand, we're typically seeing a lot of avian flu coming in. Typically, it would have came with migratory waterfowl, and we'd see it in the spring and the fall, occasionally cases in Western North America. Now we're kind of having this weird year where we've had avian flu, at least in the Columbia Basin, for like pretty much the entire year. But I still think it's primarily driven sort of with waterfowl. I could be wrong, but at least that's where we're seeing it. And species that predate waterfowl have been impacted as well in some cases. So I think we'll typically see it more in like some of the eagles and great horned owls and things often get brought into rehabbers, and we find out about them that way. I haven't heard of Ferruginous hawks yet, but maybe that's one thing that protects them, being kind of more solitary and out in less disturbed areas.
Thank you. Kevin has a key question. I mean, are these Ferruginous hawks sort of like the J-pod? They hone themselves down to a dark end in the evolutionary. Kevin's question is, what do you think is preventing the Ferruginous hawk from being more adaptable to less suitable habitat, such as higher elevation with less sagebrush?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good question. I mean, we're seeing them being adaptable in terms of some of the way that they're actually hanging on. I mean, it's been a couple years since I've seen a jackrabbit. Townsend's ground squirrels, I mean, after that, a winter of February, March of 2019, I haven't seen the Townsend's ground squirrel. And they used to be along the roadsides and in the vineyards and in the orchards. So so I think they're just seeing some really drastic changes happening really quick. And you know, on an individual level, or on a adaptation, genetic level, there's just no time that's occurred. On an individual level, I mean, I think we do see the species often become specialists. One pair will primarily, those prey studies show that they'll primarily be, okay, these are pocket gopher, hunters, and they know and learn how to hunt pocket gophers. They'll sit and watch the mound of dirt in, the alfalfa field, and as soon as it moves, they come down, pounce, and carry off the pocket gopher. Now that's a lot smaller than, a jackrabbit, but they are adapting in that way, and Mormon crickets and some of the other food that they're eating. But why are they kind of lower elevation in the basin and restricting their range? Why aren't they in the Okanagan Valley? Why aren't they in Yakima County anymore? I'm not too sure, but that's a good question.
Well, Jason, I'd like to follow that one with that slide that you showed that had the orange going up into Canada. What do we know? I realize these birds are seemingly not migrating and staying in different areas, but what do we know about that habitat group? Do you have any insight in there?
Yeah, I think in the Alberta plains, they have a lot of Richardson's ground squirrel up there. That's thought to be the primary food up there. They, they're kind of listed in Canada and Alberta, though they've had some minor local increases in some of the populations there. I don't know as much about what's happening, but enough that our hawks seem to be able to come infiltrate, and they do have a large number of breeding Ferruginous hawks there as well. So they do have their own resident hawks, or at least breeding hawks, that ours then presumably come and join. Interesting to think about how the timing of those birds might differ from our birds in the Columbia Basin. But yeah, in the Canadian provinces, they're either listed as threatened or they go back and forth from threatened and species of concern in Canada a few times over the past couple decades. So they kind of make some gains and then maybe lose them and then get relisted and just kind of drop down to the watch list again. So, but yeah, I don't have a lot more information on that, but we saw the comparison of the home ranges was done in Alberta and those provinces where those birds are breeding and foraging in that area during the breeding season, and their home ranges are extremely much smaller than the ones in Washington. So they're presumably more packed in and have more prey resources within their home ranges. So the species overall is not, currently listed in any status federally, but there's many places where there seem to be some declines. So
does anyone else, let's see here, one just popped in. Seems like, ooh, John's using 4-letter codes. Seems like ferruginous hawks are aiding and abetting rivals when they abandon a nest that is taken over by, say, a great horned owl that likely eats the same prey.
yeah. Great horned owls, the great horned owls are on site. They're nesting typically earlier. So I don't think they're, well, no, the hawks are there pretty early too. But yeah, I mean, I'd say ravens, doing these surveys, the number of ravens in the Columbia Basin have increased tremendously over the past several decades. I think I have an old Audubon map that identifies a place in Benton County to see where you can see nesting ravens on the cliffs. And I'm like,
oh my gosh.
Now you can see them everywhere. So I think but the interactions with some of those species, I've heard that they're kind of more of a gentle giant. They're more likely to get chased off and harassed, even though they're larger than some of the, other species that are harassing them in terms of whether it's Swainson's hawks or owls or ravens.
Well, it would seem, Jason, you're going to be central in the development plan, the one that you say will succeed the, 1994 version or something like that? Do you have a little sneak preview for some of the things that you might be lobbying for?
I mean, I think it's just going to be, I wish I had the answer. I wish, if we had some solid ideas, we really got to start at the base. We are going to be looking at ground squirrels. They're kind of rising as a WDFW priority taxon group. We've been doing surveys, a few big surveys for Washington ground squirrels over the past few years. This year, we're revisiting all known historic ground squirrel colonies of Townsend's and Washington ground squirrels. It's going to be a big effort. I may have a call for volunteers. I'm not sure. Haven't really had the whole protocol kind of get ironed out yet, but we just need to get back out and see what's happening and where is happening for these ground squirrels. And if we can protect, I think you could quickly, if we could provide prey, abundant ground squirrels, if we could protect habitat that brought back jackrabbits, the hawks would do the rest. I don't think it's something specific that these hawks, it's just they don't have anything to eat. They're just not reproducing at a sustainable rate. And a few losses to the adults, maybe on migration or through, isolated events. It just has a big toll because these are, longer lived species. And so when you take out an adult, that has a pretty long impact for the population.
Sigh. Anyone else? If you have a question, you can even unmute and. Okay, I got to ask, it may seem a little distasteful, but do you have an idea why they put cow manure in their nests?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I don't know if they, naturally would they have used as just kind of a nest lining, of whether it was buffalo or coyote scat or something like that. But yeah, I think it's just sort of a when you come up to an old nest, the bottom is really nice and flat, and they're using these bigger sticks, so maybe it just kind of creates a good platform that they can lay the eggs on, that they're using as a nest lining material in a landscape that had buffalo or other species dung available. So that could be it, but I haven't read that. I haven't read any studies on it. That's my guess.
It's probably not a limiting factor. Laurel Parshall has asked, and I hope I can. Would there be the possibility of assisting the breeding of prey species with habitat restorations? In other words, that would be the goal, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, currently we do have for pygmy rabbit, they're federally endangered. We've had a captive breeding program in Douglas County for several, I don't know how long that's been going on, for quite a while. It's had lots of setbacks, but generally it's been successful. We're not breeding these rabbits for hawk food. They're primarily for their own survival, of course, and we don't have a lot of Ferruginous hawks anymore in that region. Now for ground squirrels, the next things we are looking at, some U.S. Fish at the Columbia Wildlife Refuge has been doing some partnering with us to take problem squirrels, more or less. There's been some developments, and we've been doing relocations to try to encourage squirrels to take root in protected habitats. There's been some success with that. Hanford Sites also now has a squirrel enclosure. I got them in touch with some of the basically pest control folks and said, well, ask them, they may be getting calls about problem ground squirrels. And sure enough, they found a landowner who was looking to develop something and wanted these ground squirrels eradicated or removed. So they've relocated the ground squirrels, or a portion of them, to experimental site on Hanford where there used to be a colony, but it blinked out for some reason. So not necessarily captive breeding, but some augmentations and translocations, primarily to protect the species. But once those are established, if those are successful, they certainly then can become food. I mean, it's really just a habitat problem. I mean, we have so many other places that squirrels and jackrabbits are pests in other states, and here they're basically a near threatened species. So
well, it is about crops, isn't it? And in fact, Jane has asked that very question: are there successful programs that, of course, will enhance many more than just the Ferruginous Hawk, about paying farmers not to grow crops on some of their land in this area?
Sure. Yeah. So the programs I mentioned have been pretty successful. They all, because they're going through the federal farm bill, there's always surprises and changes last minute, depending on administrations and things like that. And it's quite a bureaucratic hassle sometimes. But I mean, the CRP program in general, if you look it up, Conservation Reserve Program, it's been in place since the Dust Bowl, and that's kind of the bread and butter for marginal farmland in the Western United States. And it's an immensely important program that almost all farmers in Eastern Washington probably have some lands enrolled in the CRP program. Those are 10-year contracts, I believe, or about that long. Specifically, the SAFE program, there's caps on CRP. Not everyone can always get into it who wants it. The SAFE program is kind of a second tier. It has a little higher requirements for the habitat in terms of native species that have to be planted and established successfully. But you know, if they can't get into the CRP program, they often come and apply to be in the SAFE program. I think it's just a little less financially. Well, I'm not really sure, but yeah, it seems that I don't know exactly how the numbers, depends on the farm and the location, but in general, it's been really successful. Now, it's been really successful in that they're willing to join the program, but habitat restoration out here is really hard, and we're not necessarily having them restore the habitat to native shrub steppe. We're just putting some basic forbs, some pollinators, some native and non-native grass species out, and they have to be within certain distances of recently occupied nests, and that's kind of how it's tailored towards Ferruginous hawks. We're not seeing, you know, this program's been around for a few years. For the hawk one, it's probably been 10 years or something like that. But we're not, or well, I think a little less, but obviously we're not seeing that solve everything. We're not seeing the population suddenly rebound. So it doesn't mean that now there's ground squirrels and everything that the hawks need on that land, but so various types of success.
There's a little note of positivity. And well, I guess we're going to have to ask you to leave us with a nice taste in our mouth to tell us something about your trip. Something
Madagascar?
about Madagascar.
Oh,
Oh,
Elaine,
yeah,
I was
yeah.
wondering if I could break in.
Oh, of course. Go ahead, Chris.
Jason, you showed a sort of a circular annual migration route covering the northwestern United States. And it sounded like that was kind of what the species is doing. And you indicated in a different slide that there were perhaps 25 breeding pairs in Washington state, which kind of leads me to the question, are there other ferruginous hawks that are in a different cycle, or is that really 25 some breeding pairs actually the whole United States breeding population?
Sure. Let me clarify. Most of the information I was presenting was specific only to Washington. So the number of the pairs is only restricted to the Washington population. There are ferruginous hawks nesting in greater numbers in Oregon, southeastern Oregon, southeast Idaho, Montana, and states on the east of the Rockies and Canadian provinces also have fairly more robust populations. And their seasonal movements of those populations, I'm less familiar with. The data that I was able to show with the migration is only birds that were breeding in Washington. So they were tagged of that, group of, couple dozen to 50, over, they weren't tagged currently when we only have 20 some pair, but back when there were more like 50 or so pair, subset were tagged and marked and followed with those transmitters for several years. And that was the data that I was showing. Even though they breed in Washington, they're using, gosh, like every Western state that's that there is. And now I don't know if that circular migration, I don't think something like that happens east of the Rockies, but I'm not too sure. And I don't know if Oregon birds are doing the same thing, exploiting resources over the continental divide. Maybe to some extent, but they're also closer to California, so maybe some of them just go south quicker. But yeah, sorry for the that wasn't clear.
Thank you.
In a similar vein, Jason, Nancy Miller's asking, do they nest in Idaho? She mentions that there is some shrub-steppe and rodents over there too.
Yep. Yeah. So I think south, not in the Panhandle, but southern Boise area south of there. Yeah, there's actually a quite a few a decent number of birds breeding down there in Idaho. And eastern Oregon as well. You can see I'd say the best place to see them in Washington probably might be the area out around Palouse Falls in Washtenaw. As well as there are a few nest platforms in Walla Walla County that are I think visible from the road, and if those are occupied, people can see those too. I guess I wanted to mention that, but yeah. Oh, I lost control of my thing here. I was going to look breeding map, and yeah, and like I said, Canadian provinces have them. Eastern Montana, Wyoming, Utah, northern Nevada. So this isn't a species. So maybe that's the uplifting part, is that all the eggs aren't in Washington basket. You know, we do have the species in several breeding in several other Western states.
Yes. Well, you know, the questions are getting more strategic. Are there any crops that are more tolerant to or even aided by the effects of ground squirrel nesting? We want to grow more of those crops.
So, I mean, I hear, I'm not sure, but it seems like in terms of irrigated crop, alfalfa seems to attract a lot of ground squirrels and pocket gophers, probably to the detriment of those animals. But yeah, I'd have to think of, you know, I've heard excuses for why people don't want ground squirrels on their farm or whatnot for various, you know, from we're worried they'll chew on the equipment or something to you know, they don't like running them over and they just would rather get them off the road. And I don't know how much, yeah, I don't know. A lot of the calls when I moved to Washington that I'd get complaining about ground squirrels were more people not wanting them in their yards or near their subdivisions that they are building in the shrub steppe here. So, but irrigation districts and all of those folks tend to not like burrowing things.
We need a new campaign for Smokey the Bear ground squirrel or something.
Yeah.
Well, Kim would like to go with you when you go to Madagascar again, but she wants to see a crested koa and a blue koa. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, the kuas.
Koa, there we go.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do maybe I'll finally swing by one of the photo sharing when's that one? The WOS
Oh,
picture
right.
sharing
Oh,
one?
yes. Members phone.
Remember, June is member photo night.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was fortunate. I managed to see every species of kua in Madagascar. Only because I think green-capped and red-capped are lumped in eBird. I think they used to be separate. So I missed green-capped kua. But did manage to see all the kua, and my personal goal was hoping to see one of all the extant endemic families, and managed to do that, as well as scored all 5 of the ground rollers, which were probably my top desired species there, and some really crazy birds.
Please come back in June.
Yeah, we did really well on species, and my top target was the helmet vanga, which I don't have I'm on the wrong computer to show a picture, but yeah, we got to see most everything we wanted, and the logistics worked out far better than I had hoped, and all the flights and planes and things were always on time, and was really fortunate to have a good trip. Happy to take those questions as well. You can hit me up at that email address, just jason.fidorra at dfw.wa.gov for hawk or travel stuff.
I've just pasted that into the chat, as well as some of you may have noticed that there are some other links listed above for some of the things Jason's been involved with, and also some of the things that were talked about. Terrific.
Well, if we have no additional questions, Jason, thank you for first of all, for the wonderful presentation and for fielding questions from such a wide range of perspectives. It was really helpful to see how you think about these things and how the department thinks about these things, because there's certainly not questions with simple answers. but it was wonderful to have you. Really appreciate your contribution, and we'll look forward to June and some pictures from your trip to Madagascar. And Dave, if Dave is still with us, I think we'll probably wrap it up.
Yep, it's good.
Well, thank you. That was great to be here.